Okay, so now we're going to look at subphases of competition. So this umbrella falls under our particular subphases and also our sport-specific subphases that we will look at today. Okay, so firstly, we want to look at periodization as a whole. So periodization is inclusive of three subphases, which include macrocycle, mesocycle, and microcycle. So all three of these subphases are consistent when working to divide a training year into easily managed parts in order to reach overall long and short-term goals. Okay, so firstly, a macrocycle. So a macrocycle is in reference to an entire season schedule. It is the largest subphase in terms of the training cycle, and in most circumstances incorporates the whole year, depending on the particular sport. A macrocycle will incorporate all four stages of a training program that includes endurance, intensity, competition, and finally recovery. Its major benefit lies within the fact that it allows for a facilitation of long-term planning. So, for example, an Olympic athlete training for the Olympics 12 months before competing would plan to peak at the time of competition and would allow themselves to strictly follow a desired schedule in order to do so. So when you think macrocycle, it brings together everything that falls under it. So your mesocycles, microcycles, sport-specific subphases, all that type of stuff. It's everything as a whole. Okay, so next, the mesocycle. So the mesocycle represents a major phase within the season that usually varies between 3 to 8 weeks. So a mesocycle puts emphasis on specific goals and generally occurs during specific phases of competition, whether that be pre-season, in-season, or off-season. So, for example, this could include aiming to improve power as a specific component of fitness over the course of 4 weeks during the pre-season phase. That's only just one example. So mesocycles allow for macrocycle goals to be split into smaller goals. So being executed during mesocycle phases, and it usually ends in an unload week in order for the body to fully recover. Okay, so our last one is microcycle. So when referring to a microcycle as a subphase, it is the smallest of all three subphases. So a microcycle is usually the duration of 5 to 8 days and usually focuses on one goal-focused block of training. So a microcycle is usually week to week. So this is important for the competition phase when for sports that are week to week, they'll focus on a microcycle to focus on a particular block of training for that competition. So for example, an endurance block where a cyclist strings 3 or 4 long rides together within 1 week to progressively overload training volume. That's an example of a microcycle. When planning a microcycle, it is important to set microcycle objectives. So set the absolute level of work required in terms of volume, intensity, and complexity. The training days must be allocated, and finally the relative work required, so meaning when to peak and when to have less intense sessions. Okay, so moving on to completion of a microcycle. So what happens at the end of our microcycle week? So at the completion of a weekly microcycle, it is important to reflect on the positives and negatives that were encountered throughout. So these include strategies such as analyzing proposed objectives and assessing whether or not they were achieved. Analyzing training behavior of the athlete, so whether aspects such as motivation and effort were positive or negative. Receiving feedback from athletes, so this helps to adjust training to suit the needs of athlete desires. And finally, reflecting on future changes that could be made to improve in the next microcycle. So I find this one really important to know what you should be doing next and what you can improve on or what worked. Okay, so sport-specific subphases. So sport-specific subphases are the next stage of planning that must be assessed when building a training program. So it is to be noted that during this phase, training is catered to the exact need of the sport. So whether that be individual or team sports. This is done when both mesocycles and microcycles combine to help progress an athlete's or team's desired goals. Examples of the various subphases and how they may specifically be trained in different competitions will be shown a bit later on. But firstly, we want to look at sport-specific subphases as a whole. So as the year progresses, sport-specific subphases change due to the change in training for each competition phase. Let's look at preseason, for example. So generally training will surround a mesocycle that is associated with conditioning that involves cardiovascular endurance and at times size and strength, depending on the sport. So the example I've given you is rugby league, for example. Further, during the phase of competition in sports such as soccer, cardiovascular endurance, agility, and speed will be further developed along with varying tactics and strategies compared to a triathlete who might spend larger amounts of time purely on cardiovascular endurance and technique. So as stated before, it is important to remember that sport-specific subphases are literal, meaning that athletes have different needs depending on the sport. And I can't emphasize that enough. This alludes to the fact that training will always be different for sports with varying sport-specific needs. So sport-specific subphases are as follows. So strength. Strength is highly evident in contact or strength-based sports such as rugby league or weightlifting. Endurance will be more important for sports that require greater cardiac output, where endurance needs to be sustained for longer periods of time, which can include athletes such as marathon runners or triathletes. Speed and agility. So greater emphasis in planning is evident in sports that require lots of running and back and forth movements. And we see that in sports such as soccer or AFL. Skills. So skill development is evident within all sports. However, it begins to vary when referring to how athletes' skill execution changes under fatigue and under pressure. So this is where you can see the training differ depending on the sport itself. And then finally, intensity and volume. So this refers to how when volume decreases and intensity increases, and then vice versa. So if intensity is lower, then volume would be higher. So for example, training before playing finals in basketball will have more of a focus on high intensity and technique rather than volume of training. So this isn't to say that these fitness components wouldn't be trained or utilized in all sports. However, I'm just providing examples as to how greater emphasis on particular sport-specific subphases may vary depending on the sport itself.